For years, fans assumed they knew why these men walked away. They assumed it was schedule conflicts, solo careers, family time, the kind of polite explanations that get offered when nobody wants to say what really happened. But Bill Gaither recently sat down and said something he has never said publicly in quite this way before. And once you hear it, the stories you thought you knew about Guy Penrod, Michael English, David Phelps, Russ Taff and the others, they all look different. What Bill said was not dramatic, it was not an accusation, it was something quieter than that, and somehow more revealing. By the time we get to the 10-minute mark of this video, you'll understand why so many people inside the gospel community already knew this, and why nobody said it out loud until now. Stay with us, because the full picture of what has been happening inside the Gaither Vocal Band for the past 3 decades is not the story most fans think they've been watching. The Gaither Vocal Band is not simply a music group. For the millions of Americans who have spent decades watching the homecoming videos, those beloved VHS tapes and DVDs that filled living rooms and church fellowship halls from the early 1990s onward, the vocal band was something closer to a spiritual family. Bill Gaither assembled these singers not just for their voices, though the voices were extraordinary. He assembled them because each man carried something in him that audiences could feel. Guy Penrod with that long hair and that thunderous baritone that could rattle a gymnasium and then drop to a whisper that made grown men weep. David Phelps, whose tenor voice climbs to places that seem physiologically impossible, a voice that many fans still describe as the most gifted pure instrument in the history of gospel music. Michael English, whose 1991 debut with the group was one of the most electric arrivals in contemporary Christian music. Russ Taff, already a legend before he ever stood beside Bill Gaither, bringing with him a lifetime of struggle and triumph that you could hear in every syllable he sang. Lowry, who held the unusual position of being genuinely funny and genuinely anointed in the same breath, the man who co-wrote Mary Did You Know, which has become one of the most recorded Christmas songs in the modern era, and Hampton, whose smooth, warm baritone gave the group a steadiness and grace that audiences came to depend on, and Linda Randall, not a formal member of the vocal band, but a constant presence in the homecoming world, a woman whose voice carries the weight of hard-won joy. For millions of fans, these were not entertainers, they were ministers. They were the people whose voices were playing in the background of funerals, of hospital rooms, of Sunday mornings when the faith felt hard to hold. That is the foundation you need to understand before this story makes complete sense. Because here is the before state. For most of the 1990s, the Gaither Vocal Band was as stable and beloved a group as gospel music had ever produced. The homecoming videos were selling in numbers that astonished the Christian music industry. The concerts were filling venues. Bill Gaither had built something that felt permanent, not just a recording project but a genuine ministry institution. And then, one by one, the voices started to leave. Michael English was the first significant departure, and it came under circumstances that shook the gospel world in 1994, but that was only the beginning. Over the next 3 decades, the roster of the Gaither Vocal Band changed so many times that longtime fans sometimes struggled to keep count. The public explanations were always gracious, always measured, and always just slightly incomplete, and that is what makes what Bill Gaither said recently so worth paying attention to. A conversation that started as a routine historical reflection on the vocal band's legacy took a turn when Bill said something that shifted the entire tone. He admitted that for a long time he felt he had failed some of these men, not musically and not professionally, but in a simpler and more human way. He had not always understood what they were carrying. 60 years in gospel music, and that is the thing Bill Gaither chose to say out loud. Bill is not someone who reaches for dramatic admissions, which is exactly why that one lands so hard. When a man who has spent his entire adult life as one of the steadiest, most gracious figures in American Christian music says he did not see what was happening with the people closest to him, that deserves to be taken seriously, because it reframes nearly every departure that ever came out of that group. Stepping back from Bill's words for a moment, consider what his place in American Christian culture actually means. Songs Bill wrote with his wife Gloria, including He Touched Me, Because He Lives, and The King Is Coming, are not simply popular hymns. They are woven into the devotional memory of an entire generation of American believers. And when the man who wrote those songs says he failed someone, the weight of that statement is difficult to put into words. This was not a music executive reflecting on a staffing decision. These were the words of a shepherd looking back at his flock and wondering who he had not seen clearly enough. Decades of ministry preceded that admission, along with thousands of concerts, hundreds of homecoming recordings produced in gymnasiums and church sanctuaries and television studios across the country, and a lifetime spent assembling rooms full of broken and gifted people, and asking them to make something beautiful together. And at the end of all of that came the admission, quiet and unhurried and completely sincere, that he had not always understood what these men were carrying. Michael English was the first real test of what that admission means in practice. When Michael left in 1994, the public story was a personal moral failure, an extramarital affair he disclosed himself, a GMA Dove Award he returned, and a career that came apart almost overnight. But what Bill's recent reflection suggests is that a dimension of Michael's struggle was never fully addressed, because the culture of Christian music in the mid-90s had almost no language for it. Michael was dealing with addiction, something he has spoken about openly in the years since, and the gospel world of that era had no framework for a man who was genuinely anointed and genuinely broken at the same time. And here's the thing that most coverage of this story has almost entirely ignored. During some of Michael's darkest years, Bill reached out, not publicly, and not in any way designed to generate attention, but the way a father reaches out to a son who has wandered, quietly and persistently, and without conditions. Michael English returned to the Gaither stage not once but multiple times in the decades that followed, and each return carried more emotional weight than the last, because it was not a business arrangement. Restoration is a different thing entirely, and if you have ever watched the footage of those reunion moments, Michael standing beside Bill again with the audience on its feet, you already know what Bill Gaither has always been building toward, not a perfect group, but a redeemed one. And that pattern with Michael turns out to be the template for nearly every significant departure from the Gaither Vocal Band. Guy Penrod left in 2008, and the reason he gave was his family. He and his wife Angie had 8 children, and the demands of constant touring had grown incompatible with the kind of father he wanted to be. That reason is real, and it is honorable, but Guy has spoken in interviews about something deeper running underneath it, a spiritual exhaustion that was not simply physical fatigue, going through the motions of ministry without the inner life to sustain it. That is how he described it, and for a man whose faith is as central to his public identity as Guy Penrod's faith is, that kind of honesty is worth sitting with. What the homecoming era actually looked like in its peak years, roughly 1993 through the early 2000s, is something fans saw only in its finished form on those VHS tapes. Behind those recordings were marathon sessions that gathered dozens of gospel artists in a single location for days at a time, with singers expected to be emotionally present, spiritually open, vocally fresh, and personally available to one another in ways that most professional musical environments never demand. And when the recording finished, the road resumed. Tour buses, hotel rooms, cities that blurred together before the next stop appeared on the schedule. The fruit that pace produced was extraordinary, but the cost it extracted from ordinary human beings was real. Guy once described arriving home after a long stretch of touring and standing in his own kitchen feeling like a stranger, with his children growing up in chapters he had missed, and Angie managing the household largely alone, and doing it with grace, but under a weight that was genuinely heavy. Stepping away from the vocal band in 2008 was one of the hardest decisions of his life, and it was also, by his own account, one of the most necessary. He was not leaving the ministry. He was moving toward his family before the distance became permanent. What fans could not fully see, and what Bill has only recently begun to acknowledge openly, is that the system itself made these kinds of breaking points nearly inevitable. Building a ministry on the gifts of human beings, asking those human beings to pour themselves out night after night and year after year, without adequate space for rest or honest conversation about struggle. That is a structure that carries its own risks, however unintentional. For some of these men, the breaking point arrived publicly. For others, it happened quietly, in private rooms where no cameras followed. David Phelps left and returned, and left again, a pattern that genuinely confused fans who could not understand why someone with that voice would walk away from the platform Bill Gaither provided. David has been open about the tension between his artistic ambitions and the requirements of ensemble singing, and the Gaither format, as beloved as it is, does not leave room for individual creative deviation. Pursuing orchestral projects like Revelation and Life is Good required the kind of creative independence that membership in the vocal band made impossible, and stepping away was not a rejection of the Gaither family so much as an act of faithfulness to the full scope of what was placed inside him. David has said that those solo recordings gave him space to discover what he was capable of when not shaped by the requirements of group harmony. And what he found was that the voice people heard on the Gaither stage was only part of what was there. Bill Gaither understood that, and the fact that the door has always stayed open, that David has returned to the Gaither stage multiple times, reflects something about the kind of relationship Bill builds with his singers. Not possessive, not transactional, just open. The way a good father keeps the door open for a son who needs to find his own way for a season. Russ Taff's story carries the most weight of any departure in this conversation, because Russ did not simply leave the Gaither Vocal Band. For years, Russ lived with a secret that came close to destroying him. His struggle with alcoholism, which he and his wife Tori documented in the 2017 film I Still Believe the Russ Taff Story, stayed hidden from nearly everyone in the gospel world for decades. Singing about grace while privately drowning in addiction, ministering to audiences about the faithfulness of God while his family quietly lived in crisis at home, that was the reality behind the voice people heard from the stage. Bill Gaither knew Russ for years before any of this became public, recorded alongside him, shared those stages, and has said in reflection that he did not see what was happening. And that raises the question this whole video has been moving toward: how many of these men were struggling in ways that the culture of professional gospel ministry made it nearly impossible to acknowledge? The answer Bill is now giving, quietly and carefully, is that it was more than anyone knew. Tori Taff has spoken in interviews about the systems of concealment that kept Russ's secret intact for so long. And what she describes is a rhythm of life in which there was simply never enough stillness for the truth to surface. Russ was always moving, always singing, always needed somewhere, and the genuine spiritual need of the audiences who came to those concerts, people seeking something real, made it almost impossible for him to stop and say that he was not all right. When 10,000 people have just watched you sing and felt something shift in their souls, the moment for that kind of honesty has already passed. And so the silence held. The drinking continued. The man on the stage and the man in the hotel room became two separate people sharing one body, and the distance between them grew until something had to give. For Russ Taff, the breaking came before the healing, but the healing did come, and it came partly through the same community that had, without knowing it, contributed to the conditions that made his silence possible for so long. For everyone who has followed these singers through the years, there is something both painful and hopeful in all of this. Painful because these men were carrying things that went unseen. Hopeful because most of them came through. Michael English came through. Russ Taff came through. Guy Penrod built the family life he stepped away to protect, and has continued ministering with a freedom he says he did not always feel on the Gaither stage, and David Phelps continues to sing in ways that suggest the voice is growing rather than fading. What this tells us about gospel music is something the community has been slowly finding words for, that anointing and pain are not mutually exclusive, that a man can carry the Spirit of God in his voice on a Friday night and be in serious trouble by Saturday morning, and that the infrastructure of professional Christian ministry does not always create conditions where honesty is possible. Bill Gaither built more of that infrastructure than almost anyone alive, and reckoning with its costs at this stage of his life, with this degree of candor, is not a small thing. And perhaps the most striking element of all of this is what it says about legacy. Bill Gaither holds more accolades than almost any other figure in the history of American Christian music, including Grammy Awards, Dove Awards, and a place in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, alongside a catalog of songs that have outlasted every trend in contemporary Christian music. By any external measure, the ministry he built produced extraordinary and sustained fruit. And yet what he seems most interested in examining now, at this stage of his life, is not the fruit, it is the conditions, the human cost of what was built, and what those costs meant for the men who gave their voices to the building of it. That kind of honesty is rare in any industry, and in Christian music, where public image and ministry reputation carry enormous weight, it is almost unheard of. It may also be the most important thing Bill Gaither has ever said. For those who have been following these singers since the early homecoming days, since the Alexandria, Indiana recordings, since the first time a VHS tape made a room go completely quiet when Michael English opened his mouth, you already know that what happened in those rooms was not just performance. Something more than that was taking place, and the men who delivered it were human beings with private struggles that the stage never revealed. What moments from those early homecoming years have stayed with you? Leave a comment below, because this community's connection to these artists has always been part of the story. There is one more thread in this story that most people have not yet connected. Mark Lowry's departures from the Gaither Vocal Band, the first coming officially in 2001, and later configurations following, have almost always been explained through the lens of his humor and his unpredictability. His difficult-to-categorize presence in a ministry context built around a certain kind of gravity. Mark has leaned into that framing with the self-deprecating ease that has always been his gift, but in longer interviews and in his own ministry settings, Mark has spoken about a deep loneliness that has followed him through most of his life. Growing up in a household where his behavioral struggles, likely what would now be identified as ADHD, created ongoing tension and confusion, left a mark that his public warmth and humor do not fully conceal. Never quite fitting the standard definition of what a gospel singer was supposed to be had its costs, and he has never entirely hidden that. And yet Bill Gaither made room for him. Kept Mark in the vocal band, not despite the unpredictability he sometimes brought, but by Bill's own suggestion, partly because of what that unpredictability revealed about grace. Mark Lowry's presence in the Gaither world functioned as a kind of theological argument. The argument that the table is wider than anyone's comfort zone, that the kingdom has room for the man who makes you laugh until you cry, and then turns around and sings something that makes you cry for an entirely different reason. The relationship between Bill Gaither and these singers, the ones who left and the ones who came back and the ones who left again, is not the relationship of an employer and his employees. Wes Hampton, one of the quieter and more consistent presences in the Gaither world across the years, once said in an interview that what Bill creates around him is not a recording environment, but a room where people feel permission to be honest. Building that kind of room is a harder thing than it sounds, and the evidence of what Bill built lives not only in the recordings, but in the men who walked away and found their way back. Michael English standing on that stage again. Russ Taff singing about grace with the earned authority of a man who has needed it more desperately than most. What happens next for the Gaither Vocal Band and its extended family is something the gospel community will be watching closely. Bill Gaither is in his 80s now. The homecoming gatherings continue, and the question of who carries this legacy forward, whether any new generation of gospel artists will build the same kind of honest and imperfect and deeply human community that Bill assembled, stays genuinely open. And maybe that is exactly the right place to leave it, not with a conclusion, but with an open question. Because the thing that has always made the Gaither world matter to the people who love it is not polish or production value. It is the acknowledgement that faith is not lived in highlight reels. Faith is lived in the hard years, in the quiet moments when the voice that could fill an arena is sitting alone somewhere, trying to remember what it believed. Whatever comes next, the fans who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing: these stories are not finished, and neither is the music. If this story stayed with you, the next video will as well. We have been covering the untold chapter in David Phelps's journey away from and back to the Gaither stage, and what came out of that season is something even his closest fans did not fully know.